Welcome to the Nerd Journey Podcast. Our goal is to help you, the technology professional, accelerate your career progression, increase your job satisfaction, and be more effective in your existing role.
We want to bring listeners like you the career advice we wish we'd been given earlier in our careers.
I'm John White, at VJourneyman on Twitter, sharing co-host duties with Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_.
We're two former IT operations guys who have moved on to pre-sales roles with technology vendors. We have our opinions, but we also like to highlight the journeys of others and see what we can learn from them.
We'd also like to ask for your feedback to make this a conversation, not a one-way broadcast. Email us at nerdjourneypodcast@gmail.com or DM us at nerdjourney on Twitter. So come join us on our nerd journey.
Let's take a trip.
Welcome to episode 347. Normally, this is where we introduce you to a single guest for a deep dive into their career and lessons learned. But today, and for next week's episode, we're trying something a little bit different.
A little while back, I had this follow-up question for a former guest. Their answer was so insightful that it sparked an idea. There's this trend that's been top of mind for us, and we know it is for a lot of people listening. This flattening of organizations. We're seeing the widespread layoffs in tech, which a lot of times results in fewer layers of management and a big increase in the number of people reporting to a single manager.
We realize this topic is too big and has too many angles for just one conversation. So we thought, what if we could bring together multiple expert perspectives on this single issue in a single episode?
We reached out to a handful of fantastic former guests, experts in leadership, communication, and organizational knowledge. So we sent them some specific questions on this topic. They were kind enough to record their thoughts and send them back to us, like a little gift.
Think of it as a Nerd Journey roundtable or collection of hot takes from trusted voices. Our goal is to amplify their advice and give you a diverse set of strategies for navigating this challenging landscape. We've structured this into two parts. In this first episode, we're going to define the new reality, exploring the trend itself and the immediate consequences for your career path and team culture. Then in part two, we'll focus entirely on actionable insights for thriving in this environment. So let's dive in. So first, let's define the trend. We'll start with Abby Clobridge, who we originally spoke to in episodes 292 and 293. Abby is the founder and principal consultant at Fire Oak Strategies and has deep expertise in the realm of knowledge management. We wanted to get an outside perspective from someone who works with many different organizations on various projects. So we asked Abby, within your customer base and set of prospects, do you see companies currently doing organizational flattening of management layers with an increased number of direct reports for managers? And if you have seen it, what do you think is the reason for this? We've heard of 20 or more people under a single people manager.
Hey, Nick and John. Regarding flattening of management layers, like most organizations, several of our clients are going through huge changes. We've seen entire teams and departments, including IT, completely eliminated. In some cases, the IT department work is getting shifted to MSPs. That has its pros and cons. It works better for some organizations than others. With the current economic climate and AI adoption both hitting all at once, this year has been pretty tumultuous for everyone, I think. In terms of departments flattening, yes, I've seen companies putting more and more people under a single people manager. Having 20 or so people report to one manager, that's brutal. A manager with that many direct reports has no capacity to build real relationships. Employees can't realistically rely on their manager on a day-to-day basis for much. That kind of dynamic is a recipe for cultural toxicity really quickly, too.
Next, we'll hear from Shailvi Wakhlu, who we originally spoke to in episodes 210 and 211. Shailvi is a leadership speaker and a data consultant with experience building and leading large organizations, including the structuring of job levels for different career paths. She's also the author of Self-Advocacy, Your Guide to Getting What You Deserve at Work. So here's what we asked Shailvi. In the previous conversation, we talked a lot about job levels. Do you think flatter organizations make it more difficult to clearly define those job levels? Or are big companies cutting headcount to flatten even thinking about this? What do you wish these companies would consider?
So the stated reason that companies move towards flatter organizations, I think, is because they want to get rid of hierarchy. They want to say that, you know what, we don't want the lack of a higher title to restrict you from having a greater impact on the company. And I think that's a fair goal. I think that makes sense from the company's perspective, that they would want people at all levels to feel empowered to contribute. And it might even be good for their career growth that they're not restricted by some artificial boundary that says they cannot contribute at a higher level. However, I think in reality, how it actually ends up playing out is when you have a very flat organization, one, people don't know what will be rewarded. And two, there is a lot of ambiguity about what everyone's job is. And sometimes, that ambiguity piece, if everyone is responsible for something, then typically no one is responsible for something. So there's no real accountability that you'd have in an organization that distinguishes that, hey, senior engineers are expected to be more on top of XYZ, and we don't have that same expectation from junior engineers. So that is something to think about. And the other piece about people don't know what will be rewarded, I think that's important to think about, because of course there's personal satisfaction that brings them to work and that makes them want to contribute. But people are actively thinking about what are contributions that would be rewarded? What is a way that I can grow in my career? And I think titles are a good way that companies typically acknowledge that. It allows people to sort of measure their own progress and see that I was at this level, I went to the next level. It gives them something to aim for. So if there is not that definition of what is expected at each level, some people, they may not have the tools to figure out what they should aim for. I think in some companies, especially I would say some old school companies back in the day, they used to just have it set as, we're just going to anchor on years of experience. X years of experience means you get a senior title. X plus Y years of experience means you get a staff title or something like that. But of course, there was a flaw with that plan. They weren't really rewarding impact. They were just saying, like, as long as you just sit and warm your chair, eventually, you'll get that higher title or pay, or the mix of those two. Instead, I think the reason people started defining job levels was so that you could anchor on outcomes and impact. That, you know what, we expect people at a certain level to have this kind of impact on technical progress for the company, business results, communication skills. If you want people to anchor on that, if you want people to strive for that higher skill set, you have to actually define them. If you keep them super ambiguous, if you keep it super hidden, then at some time, I think that's also a reason why companies end up with things that look like favoritism, where people are getting promoted, or even if there's no difference in titles, if they're getting a higher pay, you have no idea why someone else got an increase in salary or got better projects, and you didn't even know what you're supposed to do to showcase that kind of impact.
And then the follow-up question to Shailvi again, we've spoken a lot on the show about the individual career path, the technical career path, and getting up to that principal engineer role or the principal title within an organization. Here's what we asked Shailvi. Would the flatter organization mean it becomes infinitely harder to rise up to the level of principal engineer, those highest tiers of individual contributors in an organization?
I would say that it's an interesting shift when you have flatter organizations. I think typically what that means is they're not necessarily doling out titles that can help you when you are applying to a different job. So even if within your own company, people know that you contribute at a very high level, that external signaling may not be very obvious to another employer. When you have sort of principal engineer, staff engineer, those type of titles, it is easier for a new company to understand just in context that, okay, you were at the highest tier of individual contributors. I would split that into two. There's the rising within your existing organization, and there is the transitioning to a new job or to a different organization, which may have a harder time measuring your impact. And I would say within your own organization, I personally don't believe that a flatter organization stops you. In fact, if anything, I think it opens up more opportunities because you having access to great projects is based on what you've done in your past projects, how you showcase your work, how you advocate for your own performance in the right forums. I think that is very, very doable. If you keep showcasing that you are capable of handling more and more complexity, eventually you will get the highest value projects that have that very high C-suite level visibility. And so I think within an organization, of course, it can change whether it's a large organization or a small organization, but just the fact that it's a flatter org should not stop you from having impact at the highest levels of what affects the business, what has the most visibility, and what is most critical to the company's stated goals. I think the problem comes when, let's say you're tired of your job or you have a better job or opportunity, and maybe they do have those levels defined. Maybe they say that, we want a principal engineer and we want somebody who's been a principal engineer prior. I think it's a very valid dilemma because some of these companies, they have so many applicants nowadays that they'll just remove somebody from the search if they don't already have that title. So I do think that it's a valid thing to be thinking about. If you're only relying on people looking at your resume, you have to have as many signals as you can. Maybe even call out specifically that this organization had a flat organization, so the principal engineer title did not exist. But then again, really double down on showcasing how your projects were at that highest level of impact. And it may not work if it's an automated way that people review those resumes. It's going to be almost impossible to get past those screenings. In that case, I really do think networking is how you showcase that. Talk to people, talk directly to recruiters, find hiring managers, and kind of really highlight your work and your impact. There are many ways that you can show up as an industry leader that are outside of your company. You can talk at industry conferences. You can have a lot of content that you put out there, which makes it very clear to people that, what you are as an individual contributor, your impact is fantastic. And that would be the natural way to sort of go into those roles without having that title already in case those organizations really need you to have had that title.
And then we return to Abby, talking about internal risk, the potential loss of knowledge. We asked Abby, is organizational flattening causing significant skill gaps at companies and creating opportunities for companies like yours, or actually making it more difficult? In other words, are companies wanting to cut employees' headcount also cutting down on the number of consulting firms that they will partner with, or are they leaning into working with consulting firms more than they were previously?
Layoffs and organizational flattening and, weirdly enough, AI, that's all creating a heightened awareness of the importance of organizational knowledge management. There's definitely been an uptick in interest from executive teams who are coming to see how critically important it is to have organizational knowledge captured, well-documented, easy to access, easy to reuse and build upon. If people are coming and going in and out of new roles, it needs to be super easy for people to jump into new roles and to not lose any more organizational knowledge than necessary. Having said that, while we've made huge strides with AI adoption in the workplace, there still isn't a magic vacuum that can pull knowledge out of someone's head. When critical staff members leave, institutional memory leaves with them. Good knowledge management can't stop that entirely, but it can soften the blow and help organizations keep moving forward. Flattening can feel disruptive, but it's also a chance to rethink how knowledge flows across your organization. With fewer management layers, there's less room for bottlenecks. If you've invested in strong management practices, people can find, share, and build upon what the organization already knows more directly. Done right, flattening, to some extent, can push teams together towards greater transparency, less reliance on gatekeepers, and a culture where knowledge is a shared asset rather than something that's locked in a few people's heads. Of course, it's all about balance, making knowledge widely accessible while keeping the right security in place. And that balance looks very different for every organization. In terms of partnering with consulting firms, I think it's a mixed bag. Some are shifting to more fractional and outsourced roles, while others are cutting consulting budget. It sort of depends on the organization. To be honest, it feels a lot like the summer of 2020, where organizations were suddenly trying to pivot or figure out what they were going to do and how to handle COVID.
And that leads us into execution. How does this climate impact execution within companies? And we had a follow-up question for Abby. Does the current climate make it more difficult to help your customers solve the right problems if the team is leaner, smaller, and under a heavier workload? How have you adjusted your strategy to help customers solve the right problem as a result of these scenarios? For example, does a flatter organization make it more difficult for customers to commit to spending time in that diagnosis and discovery phase because executive leaders want faster results from smaller teams? Or is it something else?
In terms of solving the right problems, in this climate, we've seen it go both ways. Some teams want to speed through discovery and diagnosis because they're stretched too thin. But often when we dig a little deeper, it becomes clear that skipping that step or doing discovery too quickly without talking to enough people would be a misstep. Most cases, we've been able to work with prospective clients to come up with an approach that everyone's comfortable with that balances speed with getting things right. Several of our new projects are related to preparing the organization for knowledge management in the age of AI. These are really long-term investments that the organization wants to get right. So even though everyone's anxious to get started, execs realize that it's worth a few extra weeks or a few extra interviews to make sure we're able to get a good sense of what's going on and what the organization is really trying to accomplish so we can give the best possible advice. Unfortunately, we're also seeing companies that are making major platform and system decisions way too quickly, sometimes in a single day, without having the right voices in the room. This can lead to really, really costly mistakes happening. Technology decisions aren't made in a vacuum anymore. Very few platforms live as silos. There are almost always downstream effects. So if you move too quickly without requirements, impact analysis, and honest conversation about trade-offs, you end up with ripple effects that can be very costly and disruptive. It doesn't mean decisions have to drag on for months. The key is balance, moving at a healthy pace, but giving people enough time to digest, weigh impacts, and make better informed decisions.
Next, we wanted to find out some perspectives on the impact of day-to-day team dynamics. So we brought in Leanne Elliott, who we originally talked to in episodes 237 and 238, and who we also recently talked to with her husband Al in episodes 340 and 341. Leanne is a business psychologist and with Al hosts the Truth, Lies, and Work podcast. Questions we're asking her are follow-ups from the conversation we had with them on organizational flattening. We first asked, we've seen companies where they have one or more pods under each manager, where there's some kind of pod lead or team lead within each pod who helps the manager do things like track work, give team members feedback, etc. Have you seen this structure work well in flatter organizations?
In terms of the pod structure, I have seen it work really well, but I've also seen it go really badly. And probably more often than not, I've seen it go badly because it creates this us and them culture, especially when people are doing similar work but sitting in separate teams. So yes, a little competition can be healthy, but when it's not handled well, it's not structured properly, and there's not that core mission that brings us together, it breeds workplace incivility, the cliques, the gossip, the division. And once you get micro-cultures, it's really hard to bring those together, and micro-cultures don't always play very nicely with each other. It's a more complex structure, and with any type of complexity comes that need for more care. You've got to manage it intentionally, you've got to keep an eye on it, and you've got to be ready to tweak things as needed. And my worry is that if it's not handled well, it's not done with the best of intentions, then it can mean that people feel more disconnected, there's more infighting, and ultimately more isolated. I think that's one thing actually that is a real concern for organisations at the moment, whether they know it or not. But the latest State of the Workplace report from Gallup found that 1 in 5 employees have said that they feel lonely at work. And what the research is showing us about that it's not just a personal issue, it's an organisational issue. So people often think that loneliness is about maybe being shy or introverted, but it really isn't. There's no link between personality and how lonely somebody feels. What does matter, according to the research, is the environment. It's a complicated thing as well to look at your organisation as a supervisor, as a colleague, as a senior manager, and try and identify the people that are lonely and try to fix that. People don't act lonely at work. They're not going to sit in the corner on their own necessarily. They're not going to be very quiet because their livelihood and career depend on it. So they're very good at masking how they're feeling. So they might seem very gregarious. They'll be chatting before meetings. They'll seem very outgoing because that loneliness is so stigmatized that people will pretend it's fine rather than the fear of repercussions, because that psychological safety doesn't exist if they did speak up and say something about it. And I think that the problem in terms of loneliness in a pod structure is that, yes, these more informal or formal supervisors being closer to the group may create the environment that fosters psychological safety, and people may feel safe to speak up about how they're feeling. But because this is a much smaller team, at a much more informal leadership level, we're not necessarily going to see the same behavior from the senior leaders in terms of being able to actually do something about it. So that this, supervisor may know how somebody's feeling, but ultimately without having the power to really change the workplace scenario, there may be very little that they can do. In that kind of strict pod setup, even if people do open up, there's a good chance that they're going to continue to stay disconnected. And over time, that really chips away at wellbeing culture. So a mixed bag of thoughts there, but as with anything in the workplace, these types of things to have the most positive impact require attention, require support, and require the agility to change these experimental structures when they're not working.
And now, could we take this from looking at it as a problem to that of an opportunity? And the question goes back to Leanne. In a world where manager to individual contributor ratios are changing, does this create an opportunity for those individual contributors to take more of that player, coach, or team leader kind of role?
Yeah, I think it will create an opportunity for individual contributors to take more of a coach or a team leader, supervisor kind of role. And I think people will step up into those types of roles when they have to and it's needed. I think often because they're frustrated with things taking too long or not being done properly. It's usually the more conscientious people that we'll see step up into supervisory roles. It's not necessarily about ego. I mean, it can be. We can see those more extroverted, narcissistic personalities seeking any type of leadership role, but typically in small groups, while the charm and charisma might make them likable for a time, that lack of empathy is going to come through a lot quicker, and it's less likely that somebody would follow that. If it's an official role, then yes, it can be really, really good in terms of development and providing different development opportunities for individual contributors. It's that chance to try out people management in a more hands-on, practical way. So less theory, on-the-job training. You're close to the work as well, so you typically understand what it really takes to deliver that rather than being a removed senior manager, which senior managers would be under the structure. And I think for the group itself as well, people do look for someone to follow. In groups of this size, so kind of anything bigger than 12, 13, it's hard to connect with everyone on an individual level. So we look for that shared goal or mission or values. And we also search for someone that shows us what that is and helps us make sense of it all. So it's why we naturally look for leaders in larger groups, because it's that person that gives us clarity, that sets the tone, that shows us what's expected. And that helps us feel safer and more confident. And with that, more likely that we belong, which is also then great for our performance and our well-being, as well as creating this team cohesion. The issue with these types of supervisor roles is typically they aren't formal. So someone will step up, or then maybe they'll get nudged into it by a senior manager, but there's no support, there's no extra pay, and there's no real recognition. Now that's fine initially. That's what we call hope work. So work where someone can see the benefit of stepping into an informal role without any kind of extra pay or recognition, on the understanding and the view that this will be for a finite period of time, and then the pay and the support and recognition will come. If it doesn't, and it typically doesn't in informal supervisor roles, then that can build resentment over time, and it can lead to this person disengaging and burning out, which is a danger because typically it's the high performers as well that will step into these types of roles. But when it is done properly, right structure, right support, then yeah, it can be a great stepping stone for anyone who's looking to move into a management role who doesn't have any experience or training at that point.
We want to extend a huge thank you to all the former guests who contributed to this episode. If you want to hear more from them, you can find our full conversations with Abby Clobridge back in episodes 292 and 293. You can hear more from Leanne Elliott in episodes 237 and 238. And her more recent appearances with her husband Al in episodes 340 and 341. And of course, you can find our previous discussions with Shailvi Wakhlu in episodes 210 and 211. Shailvi is also the author of Self-Advocacy, and as a special offer for Nerd Journey listeners, you can get 15% off her self-advocacy course. We'll have a link to that, as well as all of these shows, in the show notes.
Don't miss part 2 next week.
Farewell, listeners. Tune in next time as the journey continues. I'm John White at BJourneyman, for Nick Cordy at NetworkNerd_, signing off.
Adios. In a world where manager to individual contributor, blah, I can't say the word. Don't miss part 2 next week.
Easy for you to say.